Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. In this video, I want to talk about the harp part in the symphony, which was quite a thorny thing to work through because it wasn't established that it could be played by one player because of the chromatic writing throughout. And in fact, there was an edition of the harp part that Gunther Schuller had put together some years ago, in which he called for two players to be able to negotiate all the pitches. And this did not seem ideal. We definitely didn't need any more players for this piece than the bare minimum, right? And the minimum would ideally be one harpist, right? So the first thing I did was to go through and attempt to respell Ives's chromatic writing on my own. And then I knew after I did it, I needed to have it checked by a professional harpist who could verify that what I'd done was actually, accurate and negotiable and so on. And harp pedaling is something that is overlooked except by composers who then take the time to really get to know how it works. And even some never get their head around it completely. I had the benefit of working on, of all things, Elliott Carter harp parts for many years when I was working for Boosey and Hawkes as a music engraver. And there was an editor between me and Carter who would go over all the fine points of the manuscripts to make sure everything was fine before I began doing my work. And he had learned harp writing really well and understood how to fix Carter's mistakes and so on so that everything was fine when it got to me. So I learned quite a bit from him. But the person I think I learned the most about harp writing from was a dear friend of mine during my years in Cleveland, Ohio. And I lived there from 98 through 06. And her name was Jocelyn Chang. She was a member of the harp faculty at Cleveland State University, and she played in the Cleveland Chamber Symphony and various ensembles in the area, playing a lot of contemporary music, and she enjoyed it. She loved contemporary music. And she told me, that she was having to negotiate these incredibly chromatic and atonal harp parts all the time, and that she would always respell them, and that I should expect any harp part that is carefully worked out to be respelled by the harpist, because every harpist pedals passages differently. They all have their own techniques that work for them, and there's no one-size-fits-all way of spelling a harp part that's going to work for all harpists. And part of the complexity is that you have these pedals that are on either side of the instrument, and you have DCB on one side and EFGA on the other. And so at most, you can change two notes at once, and one note has to be from the pedals are on one side, and the other note has to be from the pedals on the other side. And you're ideally supposed to be making the pedal changes simultaneously, so stacking them as you indicate them and so on. But you have to make sure that when you've set something, that it's not going to conflict with something that comes later. And you have to remember when you've set the E to E flat, that it's still an E flat until it's explicitly marked to be returned to E natural or whatever. And so this has to be thought through. The whole thing it works sort of like it's very much like a computer program. But Jocelyn said, if you can establish that it can be done, that there is a pedaling solution that will work for a highly chromatic part, the harpist will appreciate that and will take the part seriously and will invest the time that's required for them to be able to pedal it according to their own methodology. And then they'll be making real music with the part, that's the real goal, right? And the other thing that she drove home for me was that the pedal indications needed not to be in between the staves, but really below the staff, below the grand staff, just like pedals for a piano part. And in doing the Carter pieces, the editor I was working with insisted they be in between the staves. So that's how I had to do it then, if anybody happens to see one of those parts that I engraved years and years ago. But for the Ives, I thought, no, I'm going to do what Jocelyn suggested. I'm going to put it beneath the bottom staff in each case. All right, so I went through and worked out how the whole thing could be pedaled. And I determined that it was actually all possible, that you didn't need a second harpist, except for one chord, and it was a quarter tone chord that Ives throws in just to make things interesting. So with that as the exception, I submitted my work to a harpist. It was a colleague of mine. Jocelyn had passed on, so I couldn't ask for her feedback at that point. So I turned to Anthony Madewell, who was the former principal harpist of the Sydney Symphony, and he went through it, and he found a mistake I made, and he said, this needs to be fixed here, but otherwise it's working. I'm like, oh, great, okay. In fact, I show in the front matter, and I give credit to him for helping me with this. So there's a little blurb in the front that shows this. But without going any further, without showing anything, let me turn to some of the music. So here is a representative page from the harp part showing the pedals worked out. And, again, the pitches that are employed are enharmonically the same as the ones that Ives wrote, but they've been adjusted so that the player can actually play the part based upon the pedaling scheme that I worked out. And in each case, the actual pedals are beneath the lower staff of each system. So wherever I went, I would make a point of asking the harpist whether or not the part was playable. I mean, I had worked it out to my own satisfaction that it should be possible, and Anthony Madewell had confirmed for me that the part was playable. So it should have worked every time, but I still needed to get confirmation from players, just in case something had slipped through the cracks that I didn't notice or Madewell hadn't noticed. And every time, just as my friend Jocelyn Chang had warned me, the player would say, oh, I had to respell the part, but it's fine, I can play it. One time, a player at an orchestra, then I won't name the orchestra or the player, approached me and said, oh, I spent so much time respelling this that I really feel that you should rework the part that's applied with the part set to incorporate my respellings. And here's a copy of all my work, and I spent 100 hours on this, and I really feel this should be incorporated into the edition. And I thanked her, and I looked at it and I thought, okay, here's this extreme example of someone completely reworking the part, just as Jocelyn had warned me would happen. But I can't change it because of what this player is saying, because for the reason that Jocelyn explained to me, if you can show that the part will work with a set of pedalings that you've worked out, then the player will take it seriously and will work through it and come up with their own pedalings. And that's precisely what this harpist had done. So there was no need for me to go through and add in her pedalings, especially because I would need to go through and confirm that they all worked and there wasn't some mistake that she had made. Everything that I had done had been confirmed, and so all the pitches were accounted for and it should work and so on. So it continued like this until I got to the Tonhalle Orchestra in Zurich in November of 2013. And let me say that was an absolutely wonderful experience. David Zinman was the conductor, and he was absolutely delightful. He thanked me profusely for the audition, and he asked the orchestra to give me applause for the work I'd done, and they gave me a standing ovation during the rehearsals. And I'm still amazed that happened, and it warmed my heart. It made me feel really good. Also, he had set aside 10 hours of rehearsal time to tackle this piece, and it worked out that he only needed about 6 of those hours. And he said, Tom, I don't need the last rehearsal that I had set up for this. Your audition has made everything so smooth that we almost don't need this last rehearsal, but I'm going to go through with it anyway. And I'm like, well, great, that's music to my ears. But back to the harp part, I approached the harpist at the Tonhalle and I asked her, so, how bad was the harp part? And she looked at me and said, it's not bad at all. I went through it and I saw that you'd worked out the pedalings, and so that's what I'm using. I said, what? You're using the pedalings that are provided in the part? And she said, yeah, like I said, I went through it and I saw that you worked the whole thing out and it worked exactly, as it should. So that's what I'm using. I didn't repedal it. And I thought, great, perfect. I finally have confirmation that the pedalings I've worked out can be used, and they're being used. And so they were used in a performance in Zurich back in 2013. But now we need to turn to the quarter tone chord that I had mentioned. And here it is. It's in measure 49 in the finale. And it's just these 4 notes that are played as a chord in this one measure. So it's an anomaly in the part. And it's something that really can't be accommodated easily, except by having a second instrument that has these pitches available for a second player to strike. So the only thing I could think to do was to, flag this chord and make a note about it. And as I was doing it, it hit me, wait a minute, we have an opportunity here. And the measures leading up to the measure with the quarter tone chord, and then in the measures following that measure, there are these repeating chords that Ives has, like these D's and A's that are to be omitted if there's only one harpist playing. So he's thinking, well, maybe my part will require 2 players, perhaps, as Gunther Schuller thought it would require. Well, if you have a second player covering that one quarter tone chord, that second player could also cover these D's and A's and this repeating chord that spans, many measures. So at the beginning of the movement, I explained that there's a quarter tone chord that would have to be covered by a second harpist. And if you're going to employ a second harpist to cover that chord, that harpist could also cover the notes that Ives marked only to be played if there happens to be an additional harpist. And so I provide all the pitches here so that the harp could be tuned specially. And then the assistant harpist could just read the same part that the principal harpist is reading from to be able to execute these pitches. There's really no need to write out a second part for them. I'm happy and a bit surprised to report that this aspect of the harp part has in fact been realized. It was done by the New York Philharmonic back in April 2013 when they did my edition, and they had an assistant harpist present to play that quarter tone chord and the other notes using a specially tuned harp. So the instructions I built into the part have in fact been used. And so there's been at least one performance where someone seated near the distant choir has heard that chord perhaps. And so that's the story of the thorny harp part in the Fourth Symphony as I tackled it.